So I wanted to take a bit of time to talk about the new corporation that we're setting up at the Commonwealth level. Happy to take questions throughout the presentation. Keep it very sort of low key, informal, if you're happy to do that. So don't feel the need to sort of leave questions at the end. I've got about a dozen or so slides focusing on the corporation, the two major functions being the bond aggregator and also the infrastructure facility, and time permitting, I've got a few slides that just relate to where we're up to on the NAHA. That's not my responsibility, but I have a basic sense of where things are up to. And if you have any particular questions that I can't answer, then I'm happy to take on notice and come back to you. So in terms of where we're up to, so this is the basic timeline in terms of the establishment of the corporation. Obviously, it dates back to when we had the Affordable Housing Working Group and some of the work that they focused on with respect to the bond aggregator. There was also the budget announcement last year, which had a package of measures. Essentially, key features of that package included the bond aggregator and the infrastructure facility. I think it's fair to say that there was certainly the broad parameters that were outlined by the government, but we had a lot of the policy detail which we needed to work up. And since that time, we've had fairly extensive consultations with a range of stakeholders from the CHP sector, state, local government, trying to, I guess, firm up the design criteria. And we had the consultation paper released last year. We had the bill go out for consultation in January. And then, based on the feedback, we then introduced last month, and we also had it essentially pass the lower house. So we're on track at this point to have the new corporation set up by 1 July. We're still sort of subject to the vagaries, I guess, of the parliamentary process, but we're hopeful that it's got bipartisan support and will sail through. So in terms of what the corporation is about and the bond aggregator and the infrastructure facility, I guess the basic idea behind the Housing Corporation is that the Commonwealth wanted to take on a more active role with respect to providing assistance for housing. I think it's fair to say that with respect to the bond aggregator, the focus is more on the CHP sector, and I'll come to that just in terms of the particular criteria. And I think it's also fair to say that for the infrastructure facility, there's a focus more on the supply side, and that can extend to social and affordable housing, but also private housing, where the government has, I guess, the objective of promoting supply across the board. Obviously, the bond aggregator and the infrastructure facility, they're two of a wider suite of policies. So we're certainly not selling this as a solution to all the issues associated with housing, but we certainly see it as an important down payment in terms of the government's objectives and trying to promote more affordable housing. In terms of the actual structure, the NIFIC structure, so one of the key questions we looked at initially was what's the sort of entity that we set up to actually pursue the bond aggregator objective and then also the infrastructure facility objective. So the bond aggregator very briefly relates to essentially the issuance of bonds by this new entity. Those bonds will be government guaranteed to try and drive the best pricing outcome for CHPs, and then passing those funds through to registered community housing providers. The infrastructure facility, in a nutshell, is a $1 billion facility which is going to be focused on, as I say, sort of broader housing supply issues. Some of the key principles there, which I'll come back to, sort of relate to additionality. So that basically means we want to fund projects that are not quite viable, and through a provision of concessional finance, we think that we can get the infrastructure needed to unlock new housing supply. So in terms of the structure that we've come up with, we essentially want one corporate Commonwealth entity. It'll house essentially two functions that I've just outlined, the bond aggregator and the infrastructure facility. There were sort of various models that we looked at, but we thought from this model, I guess, had the most appeal. It would be overseen by an independent board. The bill essentially lists the criteria that we're looking for in terms of board members. But the basic idea is we have an independent board taking all the investment decisions. There's obviously a public objective in mind, public interest objective in mind, but we certainly want the board to run along the lines of essentially commercial discipline when it comes to decision-making processes. So in terms of the two functions, the bond aggregator, as I was saying, I guess we've really pitched this as an efficiency-enhancing measure in the sense that the financing that CHPs, community housing providers, can typically access at the moment tends to be up to 5 years based on what the private sector are willing to offer. So the work that was done through the EY report looking at the viability of the bond aggregator suggested that certainly for that longer tenor finance, there was a strong desire for that longer tenor finance. So what we've done is basically set up a model which involves the corporation through the bond aggregator function having the ability to issue bonds. As I was saying before, those bonds will be Commonwealth guaranteed. We'll have to go through a process of getting a rating and so forth from Standard & Poor's, but we anticipate it would be a AAA rating consistent with the Commonwealth's rating. That should hopefully drive good pricing outcomes with respect to the bond issuance. I think there's a few questions that we need to work out in terms of essentially what sort of tenor will drive the best pricing outcomes. There's also a question of do they qualify as social impact bonds? And we're looking at all these issues, talking with superannuation funds, talking with those investors that are likely to purchase the bonds. And then on the other side, we'll have the registered CHPs. So initially the idea was to have a simple pass-through model, and that basically means like what I have up here, where essentially you have the government issuing the bonds through the bond aggregator. You have a range of purchasers that would be buying the bonds. Say they were 10-year bonds, interest only. The idea initially would be then to have essentially 10-year interest only, then lent to the CHP, so essentially a matching process. I think some of the feedback that we've had from CHP suggests there's going to be a range of different financing needs. So while ultimately it'll be a decision for the board, I think what we would envisage is that the bond aggregator has the capacity to respond to the different financing needs of CHPs. So, some CHPs have said, I'd like 5-year tenor, some have said, I'd like 10, some have said 20, some are interested in interest only, some are interested in principal and interest. So I guess that complicates the financing arrangements for the new entity, but it's banks do that. So what we're planning on doing is essentially setting up the corporation to actually do that maturity transformation, so they can borrow, say, for 10 years, but then lend at a variety of tenors and different rates. As I say, in terms of the tenor and the terms, the idea is to essentially have the board determine what's the most appropriate based on the financing needs of the CHPs. There was that sort of gap, if you like, in the longer term tenor. And there are sort of valid reasons, I guess, why the banks are constrained because of prudential requirements for that longer tenor. But certainly, in terms of the rationale or the justification for the government being in this space, I think it's really around that longer tenor, which is the key value add. Yes?
You happy to take it?
Yeah, of course.
The EY report also showed that there still needs to be a subsidy if the bond aggregators to work, and Hillary says that, and everybody says that in the sector,
Yep.
we're not even going to be able to borrow to deliver affordable housing unless there's a subsidy. Is the Treasury working for this year's budget on what a subsidy might look like to accompany the bond aggregator?
Yep.
Can you answer yes or no?
Well, I can't really comment on policy that's under consideration. All I can say is that we're certainly aware that the bond aggregator is not the silver bullet that's going to solve the funding gap. I think the government is also aware of that, but that's all I can say at this point. In terms of the security arrangements, this is another issue that we're looking at in terms of what the organisation will take out in the way of security. So at the moment we've got some language in the investment mandate that suggests we take out security commensurate with what the private sector asks for. I guess some of the feedback that we've had to date on the investment mandate suggests we should be a bit more flexible in that regard, particularly when you hear about, I guess, the low LVRs that banks typically insist on. So I think the feedback that we've had has suggested, you should consider taking out zero security, which is probably not a feasible option. But we've got perhaps a continuum somewhere in between what the banks are asking for and zero that we can, at least consider and see if there's something workable in that space that we can come up with. And I'd be interested to either hear your views today, or if you'd like to get in contact with me, very happy to sort of hear your views in terms of what's possible on that front.
Thanks, Nathan. Are you able to speak to the availability of the bond aggregator for construction financing?
Yep, that was my next point. So on that other slide that I had previously, we've actually got construction finance as one of the end uses, if you like, in terms of the funds that are being sourced. So again, there's quite a lot of active discussion around whether the bond aggregator should be playing in this space. I think our view is, on balance, there is an argument for the bond aggregator to have a role. I think we do have to be mindful of where the private sector, through the banks, sort of sit in this market as well. So some of the feedback that we've got, for example, from the banks has been, we being the banks, would like to finance on the construction side. We're well equipped to deal with the risks associated with construction finance. And then if the BA is providing essentially the takeout finance, it gives us an opportunity to exit. There's been some commentary about potentially being a little bit more relaxed around the collateral that they require, because they've got that confidence that the bond aggregator will come in at that takeout phase. But I think it's one of these things that we're still trying to sort of feel our way through in terms of what's the best way for the bond aggregator to complement the private sector financiers.
I do have a follow-up, and it's to do with the availability of the bond aggregator.
The availability of the bond aggregator in a consortium-based project where, say, a build-to-rent or another affordable housing, perhaps inclusionary zoning type policy might be driven by an underwritten position held by or through the bond aggregator, either in a construction or a takeout position.
Yeah. So I think, look, it depends on the makeup of the consortium. So if it's a partnership, for example, with a private developer, I guess the idea is that the bond aggregator finance is for the CHP, not for the developer. We are very open to mixed tenure type of developments. Say, for example, where a CHP uses the bond aggregator funds to do some for market developments, and then recycle those funds back into their core business for a social and affordable housing. But I think in terms of the actual beneficiary of the finance, we want to restrict that to registered CHPs. It's a bit different in the case of the infrastructure facility, and I'll come to that in terms of how we're a bit broader, but certainly for the bond aggregator, that's the intention.
My question was related to the next tenure, because you've got many CHPs who might be also delivering different types of products. Is there any products that are excluded from the bond aggregator from a registered CHP?
Can you give me an example?
Retirement living?
Retirement living. Look, I think, so my understanding, and help me out here because I'm not, I suspect I don't have as much knowledge as you do when it comes to this space. But so my understanding is there's quite some sizable tier threes that are sort of players in the aged care space, and they'll have a registered CHP attached or separate to their broader business, which is focusing on aged care facility. I guess in that sort of scenario, what we're keen on is that if they have a registered CHP focusing on the social and affordable aged care, we want the funds to stay with that part of their business and not have leakage across to their regular business. And that's something that we're looking at the moment, just in short, in terms of how do you ring-fence the funds to ensure that they aren't sent off to other aspects of the business. Does that help?
Yes, it's not the answer I was hoping for, but yes.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, look, hopefully there are other things that the government can do in the wider aged care space, but I think the idea is, I think the government is keen to sort of really zero in on the registered CHP space.
So that means rental housing or market for sale, or So
Sorry. It's good to go.
how is that going to be defined? Because you did mention market for sale. So when is something not necessarily social or affordable rental, but market for sale? Is there going to be a definition of what constitutes being part of the business you would expect a CHP to actually be undertaking?
So I think for registered CHPs, the idea is to defer to the state-based schemes in terms of how they define it. We don't want to come up with a different definition, but in terms of the intent, what we are aiming for is that if CHPs are making profits in another part of their business, that's okay, provided those funds are recycled into the social and affordable housing. So I think when there's a business case that, say, a CHP, this will obviously need to be worked out to a level of detail by the board, but the basic idea is when a CHP comes forward and it's to, say, fund a private housing development, there'll need to be some demonstration that those funds will ultimately be recycled into the core part of the business, which relates to social and affordable housing.
That's fine, thank you.
On the construction finance, I should say too, so the basic idea is to pass on the cheapest possible finance through the CHP. So use of the government guarantee, we borrow cheaply, hopefully. We want to recover the costs, so we want to have a cost recovery basis in terms of covering the cost of funds, covering the operating costs, setting aside some money for reserves, and then potentially charging the risk premium for construction finance. While in terms of the sort of standard finance that we're looking at, whether it's turnkey or some other general operating finance, the idea is not to charge a risk premium. I think the idea is if the construction finance is getting into that riskier line of business, at least we give the board some capacity to charge a risk premium for that type of lending. So, no other questions on the bond aggregator? Actually, I've better cover off the guarantee and the warehouse. So, I've talked a little bit about the guarantee just in terms of it'll be in place. I guess there are a couple of aspects to the guarantee. So, we have a general review of the corporation at the three-year mark, and that's to basically look at every aspect of the business. Did you want to ask a question now, or do you want?
When you finish, just before you move on.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. So we've got this general review at the 3-year mark. I think that's to have a look at the operation of the corporation, including the bond aggregator, the infrastructure facility across all of its business, including the guarantee. We've also got this clause that relates in the bill that essentially has a 5-year sunset clause. And what that says is essentially if the corporation gets to a stage where it no longer needs the guarantee, then the Treasurer will have the option of removing that guarantee on a prospective basis. So if it issues bonds in year 3, year 4, they've got the benefit of the Commonwealth guarantee. Year 10, it's decided that the NIFIC's going great guns and doesn't need the guarantee anymore. Then the idea would be that those bonds that have been issued before are grandfathered from a guarantee perspective, but any new bond issuance after that particular decision would no longer be guaranteed. But look, there's no plan to remove the guarantee. It's just really giving the option, giving the Treasurer the option to remove the guarantee at a future point. The Housing Finance Corporation, from what I understand in the UK, started off with guarantee and then it was removed. Then they reintroduced it for certain lines. But the basic idea is if we can get the organisation to stand on its own 2 feet, that's ideal. And if we get to that stage, then we'll look at removing the guarantee. The other aspect relates to essentially which is in the investment mandate, relates to a trigger clause. So we want the bond aggregator to be demand driven. We haven't capped it in terms of, you can only borrow this amount and on lend this amount. So it is essentially demand driven by the CHP sector. But given that there is a government guarantee, we felt that once we get beyond a certain level in terms of borrowing, in this case $2 billion, that the bond aggregator would need, or the corporation would need to come to the Treasurer and the Finance Minister to seek approval to go beyond that $2 billion figure. So it's not a cap, it's just a trigger point beyond which they have to come back to government and request permission essentially to go beyond that.
Thanks. My question's around capacity of smaller organisations, so the Tier 3 providers, particularly in regional areas, to engage with the bond aggregator.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you're wanting to do a project that might be between $500,000 and $1 million, are you even in the space of being able to be considered?
Yeah. So we started off just with Tier 1 and Tier 2. Like if you have a look at the consultation paper from last year, that was the original thinking. But I think based on the feedback we received and the Treasurer's preference, we decided to extend it to Tier 3s. So certainly the expectation from government is that the corporation does consider proposals from Tier 3s. At this stage, we haven't set any sort of minimum threshold, in terms of has to be X number of properties before the bond aggregator gets out of bed to consider it. I think there's a sense that if there's a smaller project, but it's innovative or it's in an area of particular need, that the bond aggregator would give it serious consideration. We've also included some small amount of money for capacity building as part of the changes that came out of the consultation process. It's not a huge amount of money, but the idea is we pilot working with CHPs who may not be able to get to that stage where they can access finance. So, rather than the bond aggregator telling us, let's just say to Tier 3 CHP sorry, you didn't qualify, go away. The idea is to actually say, look, you didn't qualify, here are some of the key reasons, but what we can do is refer you off to actually have some assistance. We'll pay for some of that assistance. And we're looking at the Oz industry model in terms of they bring in contractors to essentially tailor advice to the particular needs of a business. So that's what we have in mind, at least to trial and see how we go. And if it works well, if we can demonstrate that through this assistance we can get Tier 3s from not qualifying to qualifying, then to me that's a strong argument to extend the pilot. But we'd have to see how it goes. So very quickly on the warehouse facility, so this is another change. It was mentioned in the EY report as an option for the government to consider. and the local government financing scheme that they have down in Victoria has a warehouse facility. I don't know if people know about that, but essentially it's like a bond aggregator model that they have down in Victoria for local governments. But what they find is that it actually takes some time to reach a critical mass to then go and do your bond issuance. So EY mentioned, having a minimum of $100 million before you go out for a bond issuance, and it may take some time before we get to that stage. So what do you say to CHPs in the interim? You don't want to turn them away. So the basic idea is to have this essentially warehouse or line, which would be like a line of credit. You'd still need to go through all the credit application process, but it would be available from day one. Whether the CHPs, whether the bond aggregator is in a position to start assessing on day one is another matter. But certainly it'd be available from day one. And then the idea is if the CHP accessed the warehouse facility, when we got to the stage of, say, having $100 million of borrowing, we'll then go out with a bond issuance and then refinance the line of credit. So the downside with this is that if you're a CHP, when you take out the line of credit, you still don't know what the pricing is in terms of bond issuance. I mean, you have a pretty good idea, but you don't have precision. So an alternative that we're considering essentially relates to if you instead don't wait, for the to get that $100 million, but instead what you do is you issue the bonds up front. And that provides some certainty for the purchasers of the bonds, because you signal I'm going to issue $100 million on this date and I'm going to do it for the next 3 years. So that provides certainty for investors. It also provides some sort of sense of future liquidity, because that's an important consideration for them, is being able to sell the bonds in purchasing them. But importantly, it also gives you the pricing outcome. So, we know what the bonds will be priced at. We'll know the interest rate. So that way we can take those funds, then invest it in sort of liquid assets, and then CHPs can still come forward and basically access finance. So we're sort of weighing up, I guess, those two options, just in terms of what's the most effective way to kick it off for the bond aggregator. And again, sort of interested in feedback in terms of, from your perspective, does it matter that much or not? One of the things that has come out of the consultations on the IM suggests that, I may not have the terminology right here, but rather than coming forward and actually accessing finance on a project-by-project basis, another possibility is that you have a facility essentially negotiated with the bond aggregator, which involves hypothetical financing options. Obviously, there's still the credit assessment and so forth that would need to be done once those projects materialise. But the idea is that would sort of be efficient all round, I guess, for both the bond aggregator and the CHP. So that was something that was put to us, and something that I said we'll give some consideration to. Again, happy to sort of take any feedback on that.
Just on that, would there be a line fee?
A line fee?
Yeah, if someone's making a commitment but not drawing it, is there going to be a line fee like there would be with traditional banking?
Yeah, we haven't got to that level of detail yet. So I guess what we'd start to do, so my understanding is the Clean Energy Financing Corporation has this option. And so what we're going to do is actually have a look at, say, what other Commonwealth entities do, as well as the private sector. But my guess is the private sector, they would have a fee attached to it with a private developer. The idea would be that the infrastructure facility is available for that mixed tenure development. We haven't set a sort of minimum benchmark or anything like that, minimum 10%, 20% social affordable. But we are expecting the board to have a look at the totality of the proposal. So if you had a sort of CHP come forward with a developer, and you're looking at a $100 million infrastructure project, and there was 1% social and affordable, I suspect they may sort of frown upon that, in terms of a proposal. But if you're looking at a higher proportion of social and affordable, then I think certainly it should be within the frame of consideration. So in terms of the money, it's $1 billion as I said. The initial idea was that $1 billion be available over 5 years. That has now changed into what we call a perpetual fund, which basically means that it won't be limited by time. The $1 billion will be able to be recycled, both in terms of principal and the interest earned, and hopefully over time those funds will build. In terms of the types of finance that will be on offer, the original idea was $600 million of concessional loans, $225 million of equity, $175 million of grants. As you can expect, everyone's sort of interested in grant money, but we're sort of, I guess we're emphasising to the board to actually use that grant money to blend it with the other forms of finance, so you can leverage bigger outcomes, because otherwise the grant money will just go straight away, and then once it's gone, it's gone. So we've certainly got a leveraging objective in mind by blending the finance. Also, with respect to equity, equity is something we've been looking at in a lot more detail, just in terms of how it's going to work operationally. And it may be that in a lot of cases it's just not going to work as a particular form of financing. So what we've changed is actually giving the board the flexibility to change that $225 million into loans if it turns out that it's just not going to work. Another change that we've made relates to the additionality concept. So, as I said before, the infrastructure facility is meant to be a gap financier. That is, a project is probably just not at that viable stage, at least at this particular point in time. So the idea with additionality is that through some, say, combination of concessional loans, some grant money, you can get a project from being unviable to a stage where it becomes viable. And then it could also, that could be in a current context, or it could be in terms of a bring forward. So a state government could have a, say, infrastructure funding program, but it's going to be another 10 years before the capital budget materialises to develop that particular development. So if we can sort of put some money on the table to bring forward that development, that qualifies from an potentially qualifies from an additionality point of view as well. And then the third aspect to additionality would be if you've got a mixed tenure development, and through having the infrastructure facility on the table, that you can go from, say, 10% social and affordable to, say, 15 or 20. We would see that as qualifying under the additionality criteria as well. So that's what I've got for the corporation and the bond aggregator and the infrastructure facility. I might just pause at this point and see if there are any questions before I move on. There's time on the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, but as I say, I'm not the expert on that.
Another part of the budget announcement was around management and investment scheme. Will you be talking about any detail about that today?
Look, there's not a huge amount to say. It's our revenue group is essentially leading the implementation of that. They've had the consultations. They're considering the feedback from that consultation, and it's still under consideration how they're going to move forward. Yeah. Sorry, I can't say more on that.
Thanks, Nathan. That's been great. $1 million question. What will the interest rate be, do you think?
For the infrastructure facility?
Yes.
Given it's a $1 billion question. So the grants, obviously there's no interest rate there. With the equity and the loans, I guess the interest rate will be determined on the basis of that particular project. So the idea, there's a degree of concessionality, because otherwise, if you're charging market interest rates, then the project should be proceeding anyway. The trick for the board would be to minimise the degree of concessionality that's required to get that project to move forward. So we're basically saying the minimum that you have to charge would be essentially cost recovery. So, taking a sort of a Commonwealth bond borrowing rate as a benchmark, say the 10-year borrowing rate, adding in your operating costs, adding in, like the bond aggregator, setting aside some funds for a reserve. That's your floor, and then the upper end should essentially be around the what the market is currently asking for that particular project. So what we're saying is, in between the floor and in between what the market's asking, the board will have the flexibility to sort of charge an interest rate somewhere in between those 2 points. But it'll come down to, as I say, the degree of concessionality you need to get a particular project moving forward. There's also other aspects that they can work with, such as tenor. So, for example, offering a longer tenor for an infrastructure project might be one option. One issue that we've considered but haven't sort of we're still under active consideration is the idea of subordination, in a debt arrangement. Just looking at other possibilities that might work to get a project to a viable stage. So not just interest rate, but other aspects as well.
Thanks, Nathan. The conversations we had in the room before you came in had a lot to do with initiatives around expanding the supply of social housing for community housing providers in the room, how they may leverage off that. Can you speak to, I guess, the availability of the bond aggregator and the NIFID with regards to those foundation partners who I believe don't include state government housing departments, only the utility providers perhaps owned by the state?
Yeah.
And what a proposal might look like if it included departments of housing land or the provision of social housing stock within a mixed tenure outcome.
Yeah. So this is, I guess, in particular for the infrastructure facility. We've got multiple partners, potentially involved. So I guess again, it really boils down to the particular project, that we have in mind. So we'd certainly see local governments, we'd certainly see state governments as important players in particularly for multi-tenure type projects. And I've talked a fair bit, with Communities Plus people in New South Wales, just in terms of what they do to try and get their schemes moving forward. And I think our expectation is that the board and the corporation will have to work closely with the relevant parts of the government. But then at the end of the day, in terms of where the money flows, it's probably going to flow to the entity that's constructing the infrastructure. I could envisage a situation where the corporation will work closely with the Communities Plus people. They have a developer in mind. They might sort of say, similar to what I mentioned before, in terms of, look, this infrastructure, it's in the capital budget, but not for another 10 years. If you put some money on the table, we can get that bring forward, and then that will unlock this mixed tenure development now, as opposed to waiting for another X number of years. So I guess we envisage those sort of scenarios. It could be a local government type scenario as well. So I'm familiar with some local governments that are thinking about setting up corporations to basically be able to put a focus on affordable housing, where they can access at least the infrastructure facility if they end up being registered, potentially the BA. So I think people are thinking about the sort of structure that they need to work with all parties, depending on the nature of the project.
That's right. Just to clarify that point, local governments set up investment corporations all the time. You said registered. Are you talking about being registered as a
CHP.
A CHP.
Yeah. So if they set themselves up as a corporation, they qualify under the corpus power. So the bond aggregator, that's a particular head of power when it comes to constitutional law. And then with the infrastructure facility, there's a whole range of powers that we rely upon. And if you in the bill, you'll see there's a long list of different heads of power that we can potentially, or the corporation can potentially draw upon. So in terms of local government, it would be sort of that corpus power that would be important, because we can't, as a Commonwealth, we can't provide funds directly to a local government.
My question's kind of related to that. What are the barriers to the community housing sector at the moment from being able to access the the bond aggregator, such as the status of national regulation?
So I didn't hear the first bit.
The barriers to the
Oh, the
community
barriers.
housing sector accessing the bond aggregator, such as the status as it stands just now with national regulation.
Barriers to CHBs accessing the bond aggregator. I think the biggest barrier, I mean, based on the feedback that we've had to date, just relates to being able to service, having the cash flows to service the debt. So in the case of refinancing, it's a no-brainer, right? So if you've got all this existing debt out there and the bond aggregator comes along and offers a cheaper rate with longer tenor, then obviously from a refinancing point of view, it's very attractive. I think in terms of the potential expansion of debt, either for CHPs that have debt or CHPs that don't have debt, I think the challenge will be that finding the cash flow to actually service the debt, because of that earlier point about the funding gap. And we're certainly cognizant of that. The sort of, I think the EY report estimated that the BA, the bond aggregator, is going to free up $50 million in terms of cash flows, which in the scheme of things are not a huge amount of money. But I think it's going to be one of those things we're going to have to see how it unfolds. In terms of the review, I guess that the terms are still being negotiated. It's a fairly protracted process. You've got various jurisdictions negotiating around the scope of work. But I think from my perspective, what I'd like to see is a sense, with the bond aggregator being on the scene, what does that mean from a regulation point of view, and in particular from a registrar's point of view? And that's part of the reason why I'm up here today, to catch up with the Queensland Registrar to sort of talk a bit more about what they do, what they have in mind, how can we sort of plan for the bond aggregator being on the scene. So I think having a look at the existing capacity and the capability of the registrars is important. And then also thinking about what we need to do at the Commonwealth level, from a reassuring ourselves in terms of, well, here's the registrars, this is their job to do, they collect all this financial data, is that going to be sufficient for what we need to give ourselves the assurance?
So for those states that are not part of the national regulatory system, they are not eligible for the bond? Is that?
No, so they'll be still eligible. So Victoria and WA will still qualify. I guess, at the end of the day, from a simplicity point of view, it would be great to have one national system rather than having multiple systems. But that's the decision for Victoria and WA at the end of the day. So this review, I think that's one of the aims or objectives, is to try and angle towards a national system, a true national system, but time will tell.
Are there any more questions?
I've got a question on the national agreement. So
Okay, we could do that now, or if you wanted to break for lunch, we could ask Peter Winsey to talk about the national agreement.
No, I want to answer.
Okay, so you're
I
David.
want to hear what he's got to say first.
You going to tell me your question? Or?
No, he wants to hear what you said, but
Well, there's extreme disappointment and anger with how the negotiations have concluded and what's in the Act as far as Queensland's concerned.
Right.
And just to set the context on this, we were promised by the federal government that this was going to be a new departure and there was going to be accountability for state governments. And this was on the back of the Treasurer saying that we wanted to do something to actually support community housing providers. What we seem to have ended up with is a very, very, very poor system. What we know from all of the study is that community housing providers are better at delivering outcomes in the social housing sector than state governments. The Productivity Commission said that there ought to be contestability. The federal government had a chance in its negotiations to actually push governments that way. We don't see any prospect of Queensland taking seriously the transfer of management of 50% of the stock, which is a requirement in the Act. So please reassure us that there is going to be some sort of mechanism to provide accountability to the state of Queensland for the money it's receiving from the federal government, which at the moment just props up a very broken system. where some of your money is just being frittered away by the state government. So please, can we have some comment and some reassurance that actually, you know, the way of scrutinising what Queensland is doing is actually going to be anything meaningful through the Act and where we've got to with this agreement.
Right. So, as I say, I'm not the person that's responsible for the housing agreements. That's a nice hospital pass to someone else. But I'll offer you my personal opinions. So, I've only been back in the housing space for the last 8 months or so. And, you know, during that time, I guess I've seen high ambitions in terms of, from the Commonwealth, in terms of trying to drive better outcomes through the new agreement. But unfortunately, the reality is, through the negotiations with the states and territories, they've had to essentially back away, I think, from those initial objectives.
Why?
Well, I think there are so many Commonwealth state agreements where they've followed a similar path, I have, unfortunately. You know, where to get consensus, that's what you have to do. In terms of what the Commonwealth's getting out of it, I'm not going to sit here and disagree with you in terms of saying what are we getting out of it. In fact, there's not even that sort of information that you know the Commonwealth can say what am I getting for the X billion dollars that I put in, you know, through the NAHA, because if you try and trace the money through, you can't. So if we can get some, you know, even if incremental change through this agreement in terms of trying to get a better sense of what outcomes we're buying with the funds, that's probably the position that we've ended up in. But you know, as I say, that's my observation in terms of what I've seen over the last 8 months. That they wanted to get a better agreement, and it's had to be progressively wound back to get all the jurisdictions to agree. It's unfortunate, but you know, that is what it is. So,
Well, why don't you give the money straight to us?
That's exactly what the Aboriginal remote housing
I mean, it's not
organisations asked too.
yeah, it's a fair question. It's a fair question, and if it was me, I'd be contemplating that going forward.
I think, sorry, just to build on that, Nathan, is you know, the extreme level of regulation that community housing providers go through, and then we see an agreement like this come to fruition, and there doesn't seem to be any accountability at state level, and yet we are so accountable, and it just seems absolutely at odds with you know, transparency in public expenditure.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to sit here and disagree.
No,
but look, I mean, this is what they gave me in terms of the slides, right? So I'll give you a sense of, but this is the first point in terms of, you know, we're not convinced we're actually getting good value for money with the money that has been NAHA. And you know, we've failed to meet these objectives, 3 out of the 4 objectives. So what are we getting in terms of the money? So, okay, looking forward, let's try and fix this. Timeline, which probably don't need. But then this is what they're trying to get out of the jurisdictions in terms of performance metrics. They want to have these strategies. Whether they go far enough, you know, I take your point, right? That there's probably a lot more that you could do to try and improve outcomes. But essentially, this is where they've landed. So they are trying to get some sort of sense of what are we getting in terms of our money, and they're trying to sort of encourage the states to deliver on particular targets to then qualify for the funds. But as I say, I think it's fair to say that where we started and where we ended up, there's quite a big difference between the two.
I think that's fair. Thank you, Nathan.